So good evening. My name is Christopher Collins. I'm a graduate of the MATEFL program, and I'm currently teaching at the American Language program at Columbia University. I'm going to introduce Scott, but maybe I can get a show of hands for people who were students of Scott or colleagues of Scott or know him in some other way. So I think my job is finished because I think everyone here knows Scott. But nonetheless, I'll say a couple more things. So Scott was my first instructor in the MATEFL program for the challenging and time-consuming course, Language Analysis for Teachers. And I think we know that events like tonight demonstrate Scott's ongoing and passionate commitment to the field. And students admire him for that, and we can just sense it. So it occurred to me while preparing this introduction that these events put together by the English Language Studies department at the New School have become one of the professional highlights each summer for those of us in this field in New York. So just to remind you, if we haven't thought about it, in 2013, Scott was here with Jeremy Harmer in a dialogue that was called Communicative Language Teaching, What We Have Gained and What We Might Have Lost. 2014, we learned about Scott's experience studying Spanish. Fossilization, is it terminal, doctor? Which was entertaining and good. 2015, it was the learning body. I particularly remember an introduction to, I believe there was a French video series where there were body gestures for every aspect of grammar. Still want to see the article use. And last year, the Second Language Acquisition Hall of Fame. So let us now welcome Scott Thornbury for Communicative Language Teaching 40 years on. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Christopher. I remember you well. Where was it, Tokyo Station, where you knocked over your milkshake? First time I ever met him. It's great to be here. It's great to be in this space. This is a first for me. I feel like, I feel like I've had an honorary degree bestowed on me. Thank you very much for coming along. I recognize current students, past students like Christopher, faculty that I work with, people working in the MATEFL program, friends, Romans. It's great to be here. Yeah, and I think this is probably, I was trying to work it out with Leslie about the 10th occasion of this, and it's grown and grown and grown, which is great. It's a validation of the program itself, as Leslie said, and how we've made our little mark in this university and in this city. Okay, so today then, let's look at communicative language teaching. We'll start with a little warmer. This is a classroom technique. I'm going to give you some key dates in my timeline. We've been talking about the last 10 years. I'm going to go back even further. And all you have to do is shout out what you think each date represents. So starting with 1950. My what? My father was born, yeah? I can't get away with that joke much longer. Yeah, I was born in 1950. What about the next one, 1975? It could have been graduate. Leslie? I started teaching, yeah. And we'll come back to that later on as I weave my trajectory into this talk. What about 1986? How well do you know me? Yep. No, haven't got that far yet, Robert. I got a master's, but not the PhD. Yes, well done. What was it? I heard the word. Spain. So what happened in Spain? I moved to Spain in 1986. And a kind of professional kind of 2000, something that's associated with me for better or worse. Sorry? Dogma. Dogma? Did I hear somebody say dogma? You did? Yes. I coined the term dogma with an E in 2000, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. I'm I'm not trying to boast here, but it is a term which, as I say, for better or worse, has kind of stuck to me like a limpet. Stephen Krashen, an applied linguist I'm sure many of you have heard of, has said recently that if you want to make it in this field, you need to think of some terminology that nobody knows what it means, and then you can trade off it for years, which he's been doing with things like input plus one. Yes, okay, so this is a way of, well, first of all, let's talk about the activity. It's a really neat activity to do with your students. What kind of language does it throw up, grammatically speaking? Yeah, give the simple pass. So it's a kind of way of feeding it in or practicing or whatever you like. So having the students guess your timeline, and of course the obvious follow-up is then that they do the same on each other. So it's a communicative activity, and we'll come back to looking at what that means shortly. And I don't make any claims to having invented it. I think I attribute it always to Mario Rinvolucri, who some of you may have known, wrote Grammar Games, which came out in the 1990s, a tremendously good book of grammar activities. Okay, yes, but the point is, I kind of using this activity as a way of situating this talk in a kind of historical perspective, a timeline, if you like. And I want to look at the timeline which has brought us here, and which I have called 40 years on, because, whoops, what happened? Because 40 years is effectively how long we've been living with technology, which doesn't seem to be working. If I just bang it long enough, something will happen. Well, this is going to make it very dogma. The title of the talk, 40 Years On, references my the school I went to in New Zealand, which hopefully I'll be able to show you a picture of, where the school song had been co-opted from Harrow, a public school in Britain, a public meaning private school, where Winston Churchill studied, and it kind of was indicative of the culture in which I was brought up and educated. That is to say, New Zealand in the, whatever it was, 1967, 66. So 40 Years On was the, as I say, the school song, and it's a neat way of capturing the last 40 years of English language teaching methodology in a kind of timeline. Though I'm going to go back earlier to hopefully 1967. So while we wait for the picture that illustrates this, just to remind you then, the history of communicative language teaching is at least 40 years old. What interested me particularly as a kind of student of methodology and a teacher of methodology is looking at the origins of this approach that, in a sense, predated, things that were happening unbeknownst to us, but only through retrospect we've been able to appreciate. No method has been invented and burst into life, as it were, overnight. There's always a history to methodology, and that's what's particularly interesting to me. And not only that the history of any method is very much situated in its zeitgeist, in the kind of ideological developments which were going on before and in around it, not just in English language teaching, of course, but in education generally. So that is the overview of what I'm going to say. It might be the underview, too, if we don't get this working. So 1966, this photo, 67, was taken. So this is to situate it. The monocultural, monosexual, and monolingual environment which I was educated. What was happening then, unbeknownst to me, and which had a huge impact, was what was going on in this very city at that same year, 1966. Just up the road, the first mention, recorded mention of the term communicative competence was made by the sociolinguist Dell Hymes at a talk he gave at Yeshiva University here in New York. And I didn't know that Yeshiva University really is in New York until I went past it the other day on a bus going down Lexington Avenue. So that was hugely gratifying for me. Dell Hymes made reference to this in a talk which wasn't published until several years later, in 1972, but it was hugely significant because in a sense what he was saying is that language competence is not just about linguistic competence, it's not just about knowing the grammar, it's not just about knowing the phonology, it's not just about having a good lexis, not linguistic competence in the terms that Noam Chomsky had introduced. He said it's more than that, it's knowing how to be appropriate in the language, it's knowing when to say what to say to whom and in what circumstances, etc. So he was bringing the sociolinguistic perspective into what was badly needed then, the notion of language, what language consists of, what language proficiency is, particularly important for anybody who was teaching the language. So in a sense, I've tried to visualize it like this, that communicative competence is a composite of different other kinds of competence, including sociolinguistic competence, linguistic competence certainly, and strategic competence, the competence to be able to activate all these different competences, as it were. So this was very, very significant. This was the first recorded, as I say, mention of communicative competence that we have, 1966. And the same year, an extraordinarily prescient article came out, which wasn't published until a bit later in book form by Leonard Newmark, who was another American applied linguist, and he wrote a piece called How Not to Interfere with Language Learning. And what he was saying was that if we teach language as a whole lot of isolated little discrete units of grammar, for example, and vocabulary, we will never cover everything that there is to be learned in one student's lifetime. That is to say, if we parcel it all up into tiny little bite-sized units and spend half an hour teaching either of those units, we will never get there. It's much better to go for the whole picture rather than kind of interfere in language learning by kind of breaking it up. And this was a very, as I say, it was a kind of very far-sighted view of what it takes to learn a language. And he was proposing a sort of, what he didn't call it, a task-based approach, but it was an approach, maybe take larger chunks of language, things that people do with language, dialogues that they have, scenarios that they experience through language, and use that as the kind of the design principle behind your curriculum. So again, that was in 1966. Also in 1966, another applied linguist, this is the quote I want to pull out from Newmark's article, which I think captures very much the essence of what he was saying. An important test of our success as language teachers is the ability of our students to choose to say what they want, not what we want them to say. And the same year, in a sweet little book called The Visual Element in Language Teaching, a very important applied linguist called Pitt Corder in Scotland wrote this, that language is not knowledge. It's not knowledge like a set of facts, but it's a set of skills. The teaching of it, therefore, must be different from the teaching of a content subject like science. So he's arguing you don't teach languages like you teach science, math, geography, etc. You teach it as a skill, like you might teach playing a guitar, learning to play tennis or ride a horse. So again, this is 1966. Two formative comments, and that I think capture something that was in the offing way before the communicative approach burst on the scene. In 1967, by contrast, this book was published, which was perhaps one of the best-selling course books of its time, textbook, English language teaching textbook. It was absolutely massive. And I remember using it. It was the first textbook I ever used when I started teaching. When did I start teaching? Thank you. In Egypt, in this case. And it was so common that you could buy it at tobacco kiosks in Egypt, along with your packet of filter-tipped Cleopatras. It was massive. It was everywhere. And it was extremely structurally based. It was the product of its day and age. And in fact, Alexander, who wrote it, said he was determined to teach the language through students not making any mistakes. The students should be trained to learn by making as few mistakes as possible, because mistakes are infectious, contagious, etc. And so the idea is accuracy, accuracy, accuracy all the way. And the way that you do this is through language drills. And so you get this typical, this is not from First Things First, but I like it because of the model sentence, I need to study grammar. So you get all the students chorusing this, gives you a great sense of gratification if you're a structuralist teacher. And then, of course, you vary the drill as you go along. Here's another one I discovered more recently, which is, although it came out a few years later, but it's kind of interesting to look at the actual content of these drills. So the drill is, why did you shut the door? I shut it because I wanted to. Why did you hurt your sister? I hurt her because I wanted to. Why did you hit John? I hit him because it gets worse. I mean, scroll down to the bottom. So things have changed, mercifully. But I think this captures the idea that the content really was immaterial. It was the structure that was important. 1968 saw further publications another one by Alexander. This time it was a course book for children learning English, and another hugely successful one. And I apologize, these are all books that were published in Britain, and I imagine that they had their similar kinds of publications were coming out. The Lado series, for example, around about the same time, was incredibly structural, incredibly popular. So you open them up and you can see that the language is bizarre. I like this one. This is from the other one. Don't do that. Don't push that dog, Martin. I'm not pushing. I did a Google search of don't push that dog. I didn't find a single example in 500 billion pages. And as for put your blouse on, I did find some references to that, but I'm not prepared to cite them in this occasion. But what's interesting, going back to the first one, in the teacher's notes of this, they lay it very clearly on the line what their pedagogical principles were. In designing a course of this kind, the writer draws up a plan of what structural items are going to include. So a list of structures, right? That's the starting point, grammatical structures. Then he decides in what order to teach them and how quickly. The same is done with the vocabulary items, of course, the lexis, but the structure comes first. Everything else slotted in. And that's as explicit a statement of a structural approach as you can find. Nevertheless, the times were changing, and 1969 saw all sorts of major, well, prior to that, remember 1967, the Summer of Love, and then there was the Vietnam War, and there were hippies, and all sorts of things were going on culturally, particularly in this part of the world, which produced books like this, which had a huge influence on education by the wonderful late lamented Neil Postman and his colleague Charles Weingartner, teaching as a subversive activity. And it was about education generally, not language teaching, although he took lots of shots at language arts teaching in schools, language curriculum, grammar, etc., prescriptive grammar. And one of the things he did say, they say in this book, is suppose all the syllabi and curricula and textbooks in the schools disappeared, imagine, in a kind of massive event. Then suppose that you decided to turn this catastrophe into an opportunity, what would you do? So these are the kind of challenging questions that they were throwing out in order to subvert the current model of education generally, but it seemed to have implications to those of us who were looking for change within language teaching. 1970, this man, again, an educationalist, not a language teacher, although he did teach first language literacy to Brazilian farm workers using a method that he developed, which was grounded in the experience of the students themselves, the learners themselves, teaching first language literacy in his native Brazil. Paulo Freire, who wrote, of course, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, never been out of print. And he said in 1970, only through communication can human life hold meaning. So education must be based in communication. Education must be based in dialogue rather than the transmission of factoids. So there was a strong change in the air in education generally. The word communication is very interesting, the way that it suddenly burst into prominence at about this period. If you do a search on Google Ngrams, my current students will be familiar with this in their corpus analysis course, you'll see that the word communication was kind of level until about 1950s. Then it started to kind of rise in use. This is in the massive database that Google has access to, and it's printed library resources. And then similarly, the word communicative shows an even more marked rise in usage. So something, again, was in the air. That communication was the buzzword of the late 60s and the 70s. And this was reflected, finally, in language teaching. In 1971, moving on, there was a conference in Switzerland of various educational authorities, luminaries within the European context. And it was the Council of Europe met to talk about language teaching across Europe generally and to try and reform it. And they got various people on board, academics principally, who started to talk about maybe we need to think in terms of an approach which is more, to use the buzzword of the time, communicative. At the same year, Chris Canlon, who was one of the British sort of architects of the communicative approach, gave a talk called Sociolinguistics and Communicative Language Teaching at the MATEFL conference, the equivalent of the TESOL conference in Britain. So here we have the convergence of these two themes. Sociolinguistics on the one hand, remember Dell Hymes, and on the other hand, the notion of communicative language teaching, communicative competence, communication. And they're starting to appear in the early 70s. 1972, now we start to see a kind of proliferation of papers and articles and books and titles. And this is the first woman, incidentally, to appear in this history, and it's Sandra Savinyon of the United States. She produced a paper called Communicative Competence and Experiment in Foreign Language Teaching, based on an experiment that she did with her students somewhere in the States, and where they did tasks and projects rather than sort of were frog marched through the traditional grammar syllabus. So this was the first practical realization. If I ever made a film about this story, she would be played by Susan Sarandon, just because the names are similar. But she, as I say, was the first to kind of realize these principles in the classroom and write about it. Henry Widdowson, another grey eminence on the British side of things, gave a talk or wrote an article teaching in 1973. We're moving on, a conference in Lancaster. And out of this emerged this kind of model of instruction, which Chris Brumford describes here, or contrast with the traditional model, where on the top you have a kind of cycle beginning. You present the language, you drill it, and you practice it. And that's kind of fairly conventional. That was the so-called PPP approach to lesson design. What the communicative people were suggesting was maybe you should start with communication, start at the deep end, start with communication, and the teacher comes in and sort of tidies it up as they go along, and then the cycle goes around. So it's a fluency-driven approach rather than an accuracy-driven run. And of course, if you kind of peel off the surface of this and look deeper into the educational principles that are operating, it comes back to here, in fact, the New School, and this man, John Dewey, who much earlier had introduced the idea of experiential learning, learning by doing. Give the people something to do, not something to learn. Give them something to do, yeah? Tasks, projects, activities. And the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking. Learning naturally resolves. So that was the kind of model which was starting to permeate into language teaching as late as the mid-1970s. The mid-1970s. So what happened in 1975? I started teaching, I'm just checking. Yes, and I started teaching here. Well, I was trained here at a language school based in London, and this, in Soho, in fact, in this, when I did the course International House, a quick kind of preparatory course, pre-service course, kind of certificate level course in teaching techniques. This is the graphics of the time, and I have a proof, in fact, that I actually did the course because I still have the certificate. There it is. And if you zoom in, what's quite interesting, the comments on my theoretical knowledge. His written work was... So my students can take heart. well, I guess I've been overcompensating ever since, really. But I needn't have worried about having a detailed knowledge of the grammar, because what was happening in the methodology was sidelining grammar anyway, and different kinds of syllabuses were coming out. And one of these was the notional functional syllabus, a syllabus of notions and functions as opposed to a syllabus of structures, which was pioneered in that book in 1976. And then the first textbook or course book to come out came out about the same time too. It was called Strategies. This is in Britain again, and it was hugely popular, published by our friend Pearson and then Longman. And the contents, as you can see, are markedly different from the kinds of contents that we were used to from things like First Things First. So you don't see many structures here. You don't see many patterns. But what you do see is topics, you see notions, you see functions, you see semantic areas, areas of meaning, as opposed to areas of form or structure. So this was majorly, majorly revolutionary. And hats off to the publishers for taking this extraordinary risk, because there was nothing, it was unprecedented. But it was a risk that, in a sense, paid off, not necessarily in sales of books, but certainly in terms of effecting a major change in methodology, to which I was privy. And it happened to me, and bliss it was, and that dawn to be alive. And what was interesting, if you open up, which I only did recently, and look at the sort of dedication inside, by the authors inside Strategies, and I'd overlooked this, but they mention David Wilkins, who was on that original committee in Switzerland in 1970, and this they attribute to him the fact that what people want to do through language is more important than the mastery of language as an unapplied system. What they want to do, not what they know about it, but what they want to do. So the movement was away from form onto function, what language does, and therefore the teaching of it should be based on activating those particular functions, and hence the syllabus. So what we have then, we have what was happening, it seemed, in 1975, there was this kind of convergence of all these different forces that, as I say, had been around for some considerable time, kicked off by Dell Hymes, the notion of communicative competence, reaching even further back to Dewey and the notion of experiential learning, and they'd sort of reach with a informed and impelled by the ideological and cultural forces that were raging at the time in the late 60s, early 70s, to produce the communicative approach, which was called variously the functional notional approach, and then the communicative language teaching, and then the communicative approach, etc., all sorts of names. But basically the key word there was communicative. And just to retract then, or to contrast the old regime, as it were, with the new one, we can kind of diagrammatize it like this. So if we think of pre-CLT, whatever we want to call it, audiolingualism, grammar translation, all these different kind of methods which are circulating, particularly audiolingualism, they were characterized by different theories of language. So whereas pre-CLT was more structural, as I've said, the theory of learning was based on habit formation, on drilling, on repeating, on that the goals were native-like accuracy. The syllabus organization was into these tiny little discrete units of grammar, typically. The instructional processes were what I would call interventionist, and that is to say the teacher intervenes in the process of learning by dictating what it is to be learned, apart from anything else, and by correcting the learners when they don't get it right. And also transmissive in the sense that the teacher has got the knowledge and the learners are these kind of empty vessels. And finally, the instructional sequence goes from accuracy to fluency. So that was the old regime. And in fact, that was how I was trained. And then, of course, a year later, it was all changed. And what we got was a functional organization, or a functional theory, at least, of language, that the theory of learning. Now, I mean, we never talked about social construction or social constructivist theories of learning in 1975. That came later. In fact, there was no theory of learning for communicative language teaching, really, apart from this kind of the legacy of Dewey and experiential learning. The theory of learning came a bit later, and a lot of that theory of learning was, in fact, came from the then Soviet Union via sociocultural learning theory which had been first developed in the Soviet Union in the 1930s by Vygotsky. But there wasn't really a theory of learning, so it kind of had to be slotted in a bit later on. Communicative competence, Dell Hymes, that was the goal, and tasks were more holistic. The whole approach was holistic rather than discrete item. You do tasks, you do things with language, projects, whatever. The approach, to borrow a term from Freire, was more dialogic, rather less transmissive. So it was kind of more, there was a bit greater symmetry, if you like, in the classroom. And the focus was you start by trying to express your meanings, and then these get tidied up for you, much in the way that we learn our first language. So this was the change. This was the huge change. And as one of our faculty members on the MATEFL said at the time, everything is communicative these days, in 1982. So great, fantastic. So like, end of story, wonderful. Here we are, the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. It was just this wonderful concatenation of forces. And as I say, it was great to have experienced that huge change in, not just in course book design, not just in syllabus design, but in methodology. Because after all, if you take a semantic goal as your purpose for doing a lesson, not a structural one. In other words, let's say you're teaching how to make requests rather than teaching the present perfect, present perfect, continuous. If your goal is to teach making requests and refusing requests and obliging with requests, then what are you going to do? At some point in the lesson, you're going to have to enact this. You're going to have people making requests of each other. And this has to be in some kind of context. And so you've got the whole thing of creating a scenario, of role plays, of acting out, of theater, of drama in the classroom. You've got students doing things to other students in a kind of interactional and communicative way, which wasn't the case when we were trained just to have students repeat and drill. So it forced a kind of methodological change. So what happened? What happened? Well, things were chugging along nicely until 1986. 1986, I was teaching in London. I was teaching in International House, since relocated to Green Park. And I was in, at the end of a busy day teaching, making requests and narrating and all that kind of thing. And we were in the bar, a few of us having a drink, and one of our colleagues, John Sawes, came down. He said, have a look at this. And it was a copy of a book that had just literally rolled off the presses. And it was this book. And it was the first copy he had seen and we'd seen. And we were going, well, it's not bad. It looks good. It's got color. And they were kind of like, it was really, really thrilled that one of our colleagues had actually written a course book. But nobody knew what was going to happen to that book. That book, like Alexander's First Things First, a decade before, went on to break all records in publishing, educational publishing, particularly ELT publishing. Absolutely massive. Great, fantastic. Until you open the first page and look at the contents. What had happened? A huge sea change back to a structural syllabus, to structures, to grammar, to discrete items of grammar. Open any book now, and you'll see a scope and sequence which is not dissimilar, unless it's a ESP book for special purposes, for teaching writing, for whatever. But general English, that's more or less, this is the model. It was established in 1986. And what's interesting is that if you read the rationale behind the design of this syllabus, you'll find it's not that dissimilar to what people have been saying way back in the 1960s. Remember, this was from 1968, and this is from the website of the publishers of Headway Now, which has gone into various editions. Grammar has a core place in language teaching and learning, a core place. It's not the icing on the cake, as it were. So this was a major, major change. Effectively, it was the end of the communicative language teaching, as we know. It lasted all of 10 years. I was there, I saw it. Some of you missed it, but I was there. In fact, It's not quite as simple as that. If you look at a kind of, I tried to diagrammatize it in a timeline. What sort of happened in the Barna countries, that is to say Britain, Australia, and North America, was that, yes, there was this major sea change in 1976 and the mid-70s when the communicative approach kind of kicked in and people were using books like strategies. And then there was the kind of all back to reset in 1986. What happened in a lot of countries, I have been subsequently reminded by people who work, for example, in what's now Central Europe, Eastern Europe, was that in fact they never had the strong form of communicative language teaching. They never had those strategies because they were still locked into methodologies which predated even audiolingualism, particularly grammar translation. So if you go to Russia, if you go to Poland, if you go to Korea even, I think you'll find that the history is slightly different. So what happened in the mid-'80s was that they were introduced to the soft form, if you like, of the communicative approach through books like Headway, and they call it the communicative approach, but it's not really communicative in any sense of the word because it doesn't fulfill all those criteria on the right hand of my chart. So the history is more complicated wherever you go, and I'm simplifying it shamelessly for my own purposes. But it hasn't changed. And you look at any literature now about methodology, and you'll find that people are saying, yeah, right, that's the story. It happened, and it was there. You blinked, you missed it. And now we're back in the old regime. Claire Cramch, for example, writing in California, says, in 2015, like 2 years ago, we're still very much held to a structuralist approach to teaching languages. Now listen, this is it. This is the key. If only through the pressure to test students' knowledge of linguistic or discourse structures. So in a sense, testing seems to be the tail that's wagging the dog here. It's easier to test knowledge of structures than it is to test somebody making requests, telling a story, and so on. That's at least one argument. I was kind of curious to know what teachers, to what they attributed the fact that there'd been this, in a sense, rejection of communicative language teaching and the reinstatement of the grammatical syllabus. So because in a sense, it's not that there's any research to prove that the grammatical syllabus works better than the communicative one. In fact, everything that we know about second language acquisition, based on the research, suggests exactly the opposite. For example, in a summary of the natural sequences that learners go through when they're learning any second language, Lourdes Ortega says instruction cannot affect the route of LT development in any fundamental way. It can't change the route. You can teach the present continuous till you're blue in the face, but it's not going to change the sequence in which these structures are learned. This is what the research tells us. And similarly, Rod Ellis says grammatical syllabuses cannot easily accommodate the essential nature of it. So the mismatch between what happens naturally, internally in learners, whether in classrooms or outside of classrooms, and what is imposed upon them through the syllabuses. So I use these two quotations, and I asked a whole lot of teachers in lots of different contexts, given what we know about SLA, why is it that the grammar syllabus persists? And these are, this was my question. I put it online. I got responses from over 1,000 teachers working in a wide range of contexts with considerable differences in experience. And this is what they said. Students expect it. Students expect it. Yeah? And then secondly, almost dead equal, they were allowed to choose more than one option, obviously. But at least half the respondents said ELT publishers, I'm sorry, Pearson, but ELT publishers are unwilling to take risks with alternative ways of organizing courses. So blame the students, blame the publishers. And then blame the exams, for heaven's sake, because it's the exams that have this enormous washback effect. Teachers prefer it, some conceded. I thought the fifth one is interesting. These people said the SLA researchers are wrong. The people who research second language acquisition are wrong, said 105 teachers. And this grammar is the basis of fluency, like it or not. These are what I call the kind of like the climate change deniers. In that 10% of 1,000 teachers say, no, research, no, don't believe in it. The earth is flat. And so on. So this is kind of interesting. So I followed it up with a second questionnaire, taking statements that they'd made. And they're well, yeah, first of all, that gives you a profile of where they came from. 10 plus years of teaching. The majority were experienced teachers. We're not talking about people straight off courses. And they taught in a range of contexts, principally adults, but also secondary, et cetera. So these are experienced teachers, and they're saying, no, it's the students want it. The students want it. The students want it. Of course, raises the question, has anybody ever asked the students? But that, I'll come to that in a minute. So I followed up with some more questions, and you can see this is, students expect to be taught grammar because that's what they've always done at school. Do you agree or do you not agree? And there was a strong sense that, yes, this is one of the reasons. This was another statement that came out of the first survey. Many teachers are ill-prepared to teach anything other than a grammar syllabus. So their training may be at fault. And grammar-based books are easier to write and easier to sell. There was strong agreement. It's traditional. For many people, learning a language means learning grammar. So there's a sense of convention. Don't rock the boat. That's what everybody wants, not just the students, but the parents, the employers, etc., the stakeholders. Then what was interesting, then I asked them this question. Grammar is the first and most essential factor in any language, and then there was a strong shift down the other end of the column. So these are teachers saying, no, actually we don't believe that grammar is very important, but we teach it anyway. Why? Because the students expect it. So there's a kind of, what? There's a sort of bit of a mismatch, no? On the one hand, teachers not really believing in it, but doing it anyway. But the key question, I think, is they blame the students, or they think it's the students, but do they ever ask them, and how would you ask them, which is also problematic. It's not an easy question to ask, because people don't know necessarily what the alternatives are, and people's background experience and expectations, of course, have a large part to play. But I think this is kind of interesting, slightly depressing, but it also reflects, I think, a tendency that education generally is going, which is into more and more smaller and smaller units of instruction. We get this coming up recently in an article in TESOL Quarterly. Angel Lin said that language teaching is increasingly prepackaged and delivered as if it were a standardized marketable product. And this breaking down, because it lends itself, of course, to digitalized learning. So if you're learning via any digital program, the smaller that you can, like Duolingo, for example, the smaller you can break the language down, it's easier to package into something that you can put onto a mobile screen, and it's easy, of course, to test. And so it just lends itself to the kind of big data world that we live in. And one example of that, with respect to my colleagues and my publishers at Pearson, has been the GSE, which I always get confused with the General Certificate of Education, no, Secondary Education, or whatever it is in Britain. But the GSE is the global scale of English, which has been trialed and developed by Pearson, but it represents a tendency which is going on all over the place, which is to break things down into as many pieces as possible, on the assumption that if you learn all the pieces, somehow magically they will coalesce into the whole. How many years have we been teaching languages like that? I could show you my schooling, and I learned 3 languages at that school in New Zealand. Or 4 even, and I don't speak one of them now. And I spent years doing exactly this, breaking it down, but not breaking it down into, this is 1,800 learning objectives. Now, all power to them. It's a great way of packaging and testing and delivering language, but it's not necessarily, it's not, how can I put this politely? It's not necessarily commensurate with the way that languages are acquired, insofar as we know. Global scale of English, yeah? And it's based upon not based upon, it was motivated by the success of the European Common Framework of Reference, which was developed in Europe, which again was a list of descriptors, but many fewer than in the global scale of English. And it's lent itself to curriculum design and coursebook publication. And digital platforms, of course, as I say. it's not consistent with the belief, the fundamental belief of the communicative approach as expressed by one of its leading lights in the 1970s, Dick Allwright, who said, if communication is the aim, if communication is the aim, then it should be the major element in the process. It should be the major element in the process. I mean, can we all repeat that? No. So, is there any way out of this impasse? Is there any way out, any light at the end of the tunnel? Because I do see it as a tunnel that will be kind of constricting our options as teachers, as teacher trainers, as materials writers. Are there any options? And I say there are three. And just to finish, then, these are the three endings, happy or not. And I'll call them the pragmatic route, the critical route, and the dialectic route. The first ending, or the first scenario, if you like, is the pragmatic one, and it's been tried in the States, in fact, in the 1930s. Because after all, I mean, I'm sure some of you are thinking, Scott, give it a break. You're not going to win this battle. It's much easier to package syllabuses and curricula into grammatical units for all the reasons that came up in the survey. Nobody's going to change that. It's a fact. And you know what? Most subjects are taught like that. It's facts. It's transmission. It's factoids. Learn, when did whatever. Who was buried in Grant's tomb? Get real. Wake up. You're fighting a losing battle. Be pragmatic. Because after all, English for many students is just another subject. It's not a big deal. It's just another subject in the curriculum, particularly in EFL contexts, in countries like Korea, Spain. It's another subject. People do it. They do 2 hours a week. They're never going to learn English in the way that you expect them to do. However, even with communicative tasks. And as I say, this was exactly the insight that occurred to educationalists in the 1930s in the United States who said, there's no way we can teach Italian or German or French in the present system to a degree where people are going to be communicative. The best we can hope for is to get them to be able to read the language. Just read it, enjoy it, read the literature. Don't open your mouth. So that was called the reading method. And it was, this was how it was stated. The ultimate objective was the ability to read the foreign language with moderate ease and with enjoyment for recreative and vocational purposes. That's enough. If you really want to learn the language, you really want to speak to Italian, get on a plane or a boat, go to Italy. Yeah? Or go to university and study it there. But at secondary school, that's it. That's all that is feasibly possible in 2 years. That was pragmatism. And was very, very popular. And it was the way that modern languages were taught in the United States until the Second World War, when people realized when they had to speak languages like Russian or German or whatever, they couldn't. Nobody could. And so there was a huge change in ideology and practice, and the audiolingual vet, all the drilling came in. But the reading method served the teachers and the examiners, the inspectors, and the coursebook writers very well. It got people a toehold into the language, and that was enough. And that was so maybe the same with English now. Maybe we shouldn't lose a lot of sleep about it. The people who want to learn English will learn it anyway. That was the critical route is to say no. Language is much more important than that. And we can do it. People can learn languages in classrooms. But they can only do it if they're communicating in the language and they're not encumbered with all these syllabi and testing and little bits and pieces and digital this and digital the other. And that was the route that I proposed. And this is the connection with my biography. In March 2000, I wrote, based on the analogy, let me fill you in very quickly if you're not familiar, with the dogma film movement in Scandinavia around about the same time, which said, let's do away with big budget movies, special effects, and let's just get back to stories which are grounded in the reality of the people in the room, as it were. And this was my proposal facetiously at the time, and it somehow caught a nerve because there were a lot of people like me hanging around who were very nostalgic in the year 2000 for the communicative approach, which we felt had been betrayed. And so this was one way of reintroducing it in a kind of minimalist way into classrooms where students would be prepared to tolerate it. And this was the kind of mission statement on the website at the time. We're looking for ways of exploiting the learning opportunities offered by the raw material of the classroom. That is the language that emerges from the needs, interests, concerns, and desires of the people in the room. So it doesn't come from the syllabus. It doesn't come from the absentee coursebook writer. It doesn't come from the exams. It comes from the people in the room. Now, you're thinking, oh, this is like completely ridiculous because, I mean, where on earth are you going to get an institution which tolerates just, oh, well, let's just talk and see what comes up. However, it's interesting to see that in certain contexts, this is being perpetuated, not called dogma at all. Here in London, there is there's an ESOL project, that is to say for ESOL students, for second language students, immigrants and refugees, called the Participatory ESOL Planning Project, and this is their mission statement. Participatory ESOL is about working with groups of students on the things that concern them in their daily lives. Oh, that's so obvious. I mean, you've got migrants, for heaven's sake, what else are you going to talk about? In class, the topics, language, and literacy emerge not from a pre-written scheme of work, but from the students themselves. So what is it you really need to be able to do with English? What is your current problem that you're having? Bring it to the class, and we'll sort it out. So that was just one of many, and it makes so much sense in an ESOL context, of course. Third scenario was the dialectic. It's like, okay, what can we take from the traditional classroom, if you like, the transmissive, discrete item classroom, and what can we take from the principles of communicative language teaching as proposed in that decade before they were kind of knocked on the head? How can we fuse the two? Is there any way that we can compromise? And I think there's a couple of approaches that I want to share with you and they've just come up. I mean, there's hundreds of different ways of in a sense, effecting this compromise, or the dialectic, as it were, the dialogue between these two ideologies. And these are just two that came to my notice relatively recently. One is called, the principle is trying to bring the classroom into the real world, or the real world into the classroom. That is to say, yes, we've got classrooms, we've got books, and we've got exams, but at the same time, we should be able to kind of introduce into the classroom aspects of real communicative language use that hopefully perhaps have something to do with the learner's needs, interests, and desires. Way back in 1956, Peter Strieben said, language is not a sterile subject to be confined to the classroom. One of two things must be done. Either the life must be brought to the classroom, or the class must be taken to life. And of course, when you think about that, 1956 wasn't so easy. But now we have the technology to be able to do that very, very easily. The porous classroom, in a sense, means that we can move between the real world and the classroom with considerable ease. And in a city like New York, of course, it's even easier. This is an experiment which I love. It's a number of Nordic countries, including Finland, Iceland, and one or two others, developed this approach to teaching their own languages. It's not for teaching English, it's for teaching Swedish, or it's teaching Icelandic, called Language Learning in the Wild. So what I have is, people sign up to do a class in Icelandic. They go to Reykjavik. They go to their classes. They're beginners in Icelandic. Who isn't? And then they go out, they're given tasks to do. Very simple things. Go to a bakery, buy a croissant, come back with the croissant, prove that you bought it. Okay, we all do that. ESOL too. But the trick is, the woman in the bakery has been trained how to deal with silly foreigners coming in and asking for croissants. Not to switch to English, for example, which would be the instinctive thing. Not to go into baby talk. Not to go into mime. But yeah, okay, I can simplify my Icelandic. And so they've involved the local community in being, in a sense, I hate to say this, but they're sort of Uber teachers. They are unpaid, sort of volunteer teachers, not replacing existing teachers, but supporting what's going on in the classroom. Not only that, of course, what's everybody carrying? Everybody's carrying a mobile, a cell phone. Take a photo, film the interaction, bring the film back to the classroom, take pictures of any language in the patisserie, yeah, so that you have anything. And not only that, they have volunteers who are on call 24/7. If anybody has a problem with Icelandic, just phone up. A volunteer will tell you what it is, and take a photo of the sign. They'll tell you if it's men's or women's, for example. I mean, so it's fantastic the way that it's integrated the language teaching into the life of the community. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that you could imagine training up all New York's taxi drivers, for example, to be nice to foreign students. But I mean, it's a way that I think, if you think with a little bit of imagination, you say, yes, let's integrate the outside world into the classroom and vice versa. And another project very dear to my heart is the Hands Up project. A colleague of mine, Nick Bilber, is based in the South of England, was very concerned by the fact that, for example, Syrian refugees in camps in Jordan were being deprived of any kind of education, let alone a language education. But using very, very simple means, that is to say Skype or equivalent, he was able to bring, so rather than have the students from the refugee camps or from Gaza go out, because they can't leave, he will go into their classrooms but via electronic, very simple electronic means. And so he set up this Hands Up project because one of the things that's very distinctive about these classrooms, even when it's they're interacting with a teacher who is being beamed in by Skype, is that it's very much me, please let me have a turn. And he does activities, communicative activities with them. So he'll draw something, they'll draw something, he'll draw it. This is all happening in real time, but over a vast distance, to students who have no access to a proficient speaker of English. Not even their teachers are that proficient. And then they put on plays that Nick writes, and he has other teachers who are involved. And this is a school in Russia on the left, with a school in Gaza, with Nick mediating a conversation between them. So this is done by the simplest means, but it is obviously for these students is the most exciting thing that's happening in their education at the moment. So that's the Hands Up project. And on that note, there's another meaning of Hands Up, of course, which is this. Maybe CLT is crawling back out of its grave. There is hope through these kinds of initiatives that I've just been describing. So it's not all over. Watch this space. So thank you very much. I'm sorry for the technical problems, but thank you very much for your attention. And I think we can take a few questions from the floor, and if you can shout them out, I'll repeat them for the benefit of the video. Yes?
Yes, thank you very much once again for a great lecture. I actually speak Icelandic.
I did know that, yeah.
The joke is people always order five croissants or five whatever because the number 1 to 4 decline. So it's really fun. Funny and I do that with my students here and taking them to places like English or other languages. There's a new book that has just come out, you probably know it by Norton Publishers, Teach Like Finland. It's a new book that has just, I know you know about it. And it's interesting how the teachers there in Finland, the American teacher went there to say, oh my God, we're doing so well.
Mm-hmm.
The tests and all, like, we should all try to adopt that. I know it's for primary school.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see the correlation?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a controversial one. A lot has been written about the Finnish educational experience, just and how successful it is, but how perhaps not exportable it is, because Finland is a very special case. But one of the things that I'm interested in, which has happened in the last year, is a new curriculum innovation in Finland, which is to do away with, well, not to do away with, but to dismantle the tight division into subjects in the school system. So instead of having math and geography, and so, not to do away with it, but have other curricular activities which are what they call transverse, so that they cross the curriculum. And so they involve doing projects which involve including some math, some geography, some language, and so on and so forth. So that's a really interesting thing, because again, it kind of breaks down some of these traditional distinctions that we've been saddled with. The idea that we have to, now it's 10 o'clock, we have to do science. It's 11 o'clock, now we have to do English. So English is kind of shoehorned into the curriculum, it has no relation. So that's one interesting development. The other thing, of course, that's happening all over Europe, and particularly in the Nordic countries, is what's called content and language integrated learning, the idea that you learn your subjects like math in English, or some of the subjects, which is not a new idea. It was happening in Canada in the 1960s, in the teaching of French, for example. So English-speaking kids were going to French vehicle classes, immersion classes, but it's been institutionalized on a huge scale in Europe. So there's lots of interesting things. Now that's another way of combining the curriculum. It's still classrooms, it's still language, but it brings them together so it's meaningful. And it's not all about teaching, today's Tuesday, we're going to teach the present perfect continuous. Any other questions or comments from, yes? Mm-hmm. 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 Exactly. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's a hugely important question. Just to repeat it, I mean, is there any published support for what effectively is a strong communicative approach, that is a deep-end approach, but where there is still a focus on form, what is called in the literature and the second language acquisition, a focus on form? Because one of the things that discredited the communicative approach in its original avatar was that it was like form, schmorm, you know. No, just have the students doing stuff, and that's everything will. Of course, it didn't. You do need a focus on form. You do need you can't learn a language and remain, well, you can, but you'll be kind of pigeonized if you only speak it without any grammar, just lexically. So a focus on form is obviously very important. But what the theorists talk about is that, yeah, the focus on form should be in the act, as it were, at the point of need. It shouldn't be preemptive. It shouldn't be preemptive. It shouldn't be presumed. Just because the syllabus says present perfect continuous doesn't mean to say that the students are either ready for it or need it. But when they need it, that's when you feed it in. And you find out if they need it if you set them some kind of activity where it's possible it might come up. Now, your question goes to the heart of it, which is there any published materials? The published materials, like I showed you, strategies, for example, which had a notional functional syllabus, but teachers soon saw through that because that's okay, but really teaching requests is all about teaching modal verbs, isn't it? Could you, would you, can you, etc. So I'm going to teach modal verbs and pretend I'm teaching requests, or I'll teach requests at the end of the sequence because they didn't know any better, because that's the way they were trained. And also that's the was easy to examine. So the fact there wasn't much publishing support. There are a few courses that came out which were notionally task-based, but they weren't really, because if you're doing, really think about it, if you're doing a course which is based on the needs of your present group of students, then you cannot predict these, and no publisher can predict these. So what, basically, you need a book which is not linear. I mean, this is maybe where digital publishing will come into its own. We can say, students need this, bang, we can do it now, we can call it up. We don't have to march through the whole book. But in terms of the methodology to help teachers enact that, how to be responsive, how to be able to, it's late acquired, let's say. It's not something you can teach new teachers necessarily because it's a little bit too unpredictable and therefore threatening. And no teacher wants to be seen to lose authority by standing there saying, I know you've made an error, but I can't for the life of me work out what it was or how to correct it or what the explanation is. So it's something maybe it is late acquired. I mean, all research into teachers' professional trajectories shows that most teachers achieve this anyway. They kind of start to move away from the published materials and start to design their own lessons because it's more interesting, they feel the students are more involved, and so on. So it's sort of something that experienced teachers do. How you train new teachers to do that is a challenge. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I mean, the materials, no. There's no course books. There are a lot of methodology books that, for example, in the series that I edit, to declare an interest, which is the Cambridge Handbook series of resources which are focused on ideas and activities which kind of might support that view of learning, but you won't find a course. Well, I mean, any resource book, and a lot of the publishers produce their what they call resource books, methodology books. And the one I edit is the Cambridge Handbooks for Language Teachers series. But that's where you find. So it's not a course for students, but it's practical help for teachers. Those are the kind of things through. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yes. Yeah. No, of course you can't. But I mean, I think learners, yeah, there's a huge diversity of learners, there's huge diversity of context, and we're never going to be able to please all students all the time. But it's a bit like, it seems to be a bit like we teach language now as if people had some kind of aptitude for grammar. Just as if we were, some people have aptitude for math. Some people, I don't, never have. Hated math, was hopeless. But we were taught it as if we had an aptitude. Nobody assumed that we didn't have an aptitude. Nobody started with baby steps. It was like we were doing quadrilateral equations. I'm sorry, I just don't. And I think, similarly with music, you've got to assume an aptitude if you're going to teach the system as a system. Otherwise, you have people experience it and have them kind of learn it indirectly, as it were. So I think that's, to me, the bottom line. It's not whether people are visual or kinesthetic or whatever. It's whether they are grammar fixated and oriented and can handle the conceptual complexity of a grammar and then activate that in their own way, or whether they're just communicators. And I think all human beings are communicators, but only a very select few are grammar learners. Well, I mean, the research I cited, is there any research that says that instruction doesn't seem to make a blind bit of difference to the way that people naturally learn languages. They all learn languages in the same way, in the same order, as it were, grammar. So instruction doesn't help, apart from temporarily. So there's a massive amount of research that seems to Robert. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
And now knowledge is pretty much just taken in passively. And when they're involved in group activities or fluency, higher
Mm-hmm.
skills, they're not used to that. And also it's the teacher's responsibility to guide them. And if they make a mistake, be friendly about it, and they will be mortified and scared out of their wits.
Mm-hmm.
In Korea, you're going to get concurrence. Fluency, you have the right vocabulary, you have the right grammar, the right pronunciation.
Mm-hmm.
You're screwed.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it is in East Asia. There's also, we didn't mention, cross-cultural aspects as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm always a little bit nervous about talking about cross-cultural differences as if they were sort of genetic or in the DNA. I think they are, you rightly say, they're to do with your previous learning experience, your education. But most education systems in the world, and I'm taking from the perspective of Spain, for example, is exactly the same as in Korea, in the sense that people start learning foreign languages when they're very young. They go 8 years doing it, and they come out at the end of it with, they're lucky if they're kind of an advanced beginner. And they, the whole system is oriented to teaching them grammar and focusing on accuracy. So the Spanish context is no different from the Korean one. It's nothing to do with the DNA. It's to do with the tradition. But what happens is that, in fact, when people start to use languages as a second language, they come up against the fact there's enormous disappointment that they've spent 8 years at school and they can't open their mouth when they travel to, or they can't understand a movie when they watch it on YouTube or whatever. I think most people kind of wake up to the fact that there's something fundamentally wrong, and they don't blame the culture necessarily, not the culture. They blame the educational culture, if you like. And are therefore perhaps more open, as adults at least, to alternative ways of learning languages. But I agree with you that there's no point in foisting a methodology on people who are going to resist it, because that's like, that's hopeless. And so this is where you need to take baby steps again, and maybe this is a process of educating the learners in how to learn languages. And going back to that quote from Pitt Corder, to try and impressed upon them that language is not a system of knowledge, it's a skill. And I'm going to teach you language like I would teach you how to drive a car or how to play guitar. So there's some explicit knowledge involved, but basic, most of it is just doing it, practicing, getting it right, getting feedback. And people kind of like, yeah, well, if you draw that analogy, they say, yeah, that kind of makes sense. But I mean, yeah, it's an uphill battle. Yes?
Thank you again. I'm actually, this is my first time, like I'm like a very new ESL teacher, and I'm multilingual, and I was just curious, with the exercise that was done in Iceland, I'm very happy that you asked the question now, because it kind of segued into my question. Do you find that based on questions that you've asked, in regards to like grammar being something that should be critical being taught, are any of those people multilingual? Because as somebody who is multilingual, and it's something, it's an approach that I bring into the classroom, anything that I teach you is going to be something that you can apply to your real life. I don't see the point in reading, Don Quixote in Spanish when I'm never going to use that. But having an exercise where you go to a restaurant and order something, that would be more beneficial and useful. So do you know by chance if any of these instructors that maybe feel that grammar is something that is more crucial if they only speak one language? Because for me, as somebody who's multilingual, I can see grammar is important, knowing how to express yourself, but I think it's more important to have building blocks to
Yeah.
express yourself.
Okay, so the question basically is, if I can rephrase it for the benefit of the camera and the other, does being a multilingual help? And actually, I mean, if I get the gist of it, is that it trains you to become a better language learner if you're already multilingual.
I think it just helps in the regard to being in a certain, for me, for example, I've traveled to Europe by myself, most of my family, and that learning throughout school, throughout college, throughout grammar school, that trip was more beneficial than any time.
Yeah. I mean, it's,
You have to
yeah. Well, there's two things there. One is the functionality, that if you're actually using Spanish in Spain, then you're going to seize the sort of thing. You're not going to read Don Quixote, you're right. You're going to learn phrasebook language initially, of course. The other thing is where the multilingual, I think it's fairly well attested that people, the more languages you learn, the better language learner you become, because you can start to pick and choose as to what both methods you want and also what areas to focus on. Bearing in mind also that the bulk of the world is multilingual. I mean, it's only a few isolated countries like New Zealand in the 1950s, which are monolingual, that, in fact, people come well prepared through exposure. The whole issue of multilingualism itself is very interesting. It's a new kind of kid on the block, as it were, that people are accepting now that not only are societies multilingual, but maybe classrooms should be multilingual to reflect the multilingualism in societies, and methodology should be multilingual. So we're moving away from what used to be called native speakerism, the idea that only the target language should be used in the classroom, and only the native speaker is an authority in the target language. Those ideas are being dismantled as we speak. So there's all sorts of interesting issues there that have an impact and bearing upon, and maybe helping restore the balance, if you like, away from a fixation with what I used to call, what I do call grammar McNuggets, these like tasty little bits of grammar, so that was all you needed to learn a language. The other issue, of course, is that the value of vocabulary and phraseology has been rediscovered in recent years, and so that's also being fed into the design of courses, etc. But yeah, multilingualism is the name of the game. Eddie, yes. Hi.
Quick question for you. Actually, I just wanted to address two of the questions previously asked. One about the textbook. How do you feel about the integrated skills, schematic, focused units with high interest material that you can just integrate the whole, all the different skills into different projects and realize, because there are quite a few books that
Yes.
that. And also, I want to address Robert's comment about the multicultural integration or Asian culture learning. The group thing, the brainstorming and group activities, the communicative approach where like you said, the educational culture is you sit and you just ingest the knowledge.
Well, the two issues, I mean, very quickly on the question of sort of integrated curricula, are you going to find that more in specialized courses where learners' needs, I mean, one of the reasons we teach grammar is because if we didn't have it, what would we teach? I mean, a math teacher or a biology teacher never has that problem because they teach biology. They have a subject. We don't have a subject, language teachers, do we? So we make the language the subject, unless you're teaching English for specific purposes. And you're teaching English for law, or you're teaching English for science, or you're teaching English for design, teaching English for the food industry. Then you've got a subject. You can have the content can be based on your subject, and language, in a sense, is the vehicle. But this is one of the problems. So I think when you look at any course which is designed for specific purposes, you see it's much more integrated, it's much more meaning-based. You look at the syllabus, it's not going to be a list of grammatical topics. So that's one thing. The problem is for general English, which is unfortunately vast, in the vast parts of the world, this is what is taught as English. There is no subject. So grammar becomes the subject. The second question was about the cultural one again.
Different cultures
Mm-hmm.
learning the communicative approach is against their education.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has been written about the fact that the communicative approach does not transplant very well in cultures which, as Robert said, maybe more. Well, yeah, classically, it's always Asia. It's always, but you know, my educational background in New Zealand was exactly the same. It was all books, 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 and learning, and the language learning was incredibly traditional. And it was like, was that was it a genetic thing, or was this purely a educational thing? But a lot has been written, and people say, no, it doesn't work in China, it doesn't work because of the Confucian educational system, etc. Just as many articles, people say, yes, it does work, because language is language is language. You know, people want to speak the language, therefore you need to speak in the classroom kind of thing. It's true that educational cultures that value facts over skills, that value accuracy over fluency, that value teachers' authority over learner independence, will find the communicative approach difficult, to say the least. But that is actually most of the world. Think about it. Think about this situation. I mean, you know, and that's what I was saying, it's actually got worse, not better, in the last few years because of digitalization, etc. It's all about facts and facts and facts and transmission and delivery, and testing, standardized testing. I mean, for heaven's sake. So I don't think it's a cultural thing necessarily, a particular geographical culture. I think it's a kind of global educational culture. And then every now and then the light shines through and there's a kind of an initiative. This is the history of progressive teaching, generally education, has been going on for years. It goes in waves. And Dewey, I mean, he wasn't the first to suggest that learning should be experiential, but he was one of the most influential in the last century. And it kind of goes, it's this ripple effect. It runs through things. The thing about the communicative approach in the 1980s, it rippled to the surface, and it stayed there for 10 years, and then it fell back again because of the forces of evil. Any more questions? I think it's getting very close to drink time, but I'll take you were first, way at the back.
Yeah, I teach a class that's an improvisational acting class.
Aha.
And what I struggle with there is how much and when to do error correction. Can you speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, when I say, I mean, again, just to reiterate, one of the problems that undermined the communicative approach, and it was their own fault, was they threw the baby out with the bathwater. Do you know that expression? That it was like everything out for the sake of focus on meaning. So out the grammar syllabus, out correction, error correction. But it was like, no, you don't have to throw error correction out. You can have error correction, but in the act, as it were. Error correction is fantastic. It's the only way people learn skills, basically. We don't call it error correction. We call it feedback. You can't learn anything without feedback. And the feedback can come from other learners. It can come from a teacher. It doesn't come very well from automated learning devices because your Duolingo app doesn't actually really know what it is that you wanted to say. But your teacher, if they're sensitive, does. Other students will. So that's the kind of feedback. So, I know what you're trying to say. This is how I would say it. That's not error correction. That's what's called recasting, reformulation, whatever. It's nice error correction, but it's feedback. And it's absolutely essential. You cannot learn anything without feedback. Now, when you do that and how you do that is a vexed issue. Do you stop them in the middle of their drama thing? Or do you take notes? Or do you film it and stop it? There's all sorts of alternatives. But no, absolutely. Feedback. There's no learning without feedback. James Hattie, education, written massive studies he's crunched millions of macro studies of education generally across the world. And the one thing that comes out of all these studies, the most effective teaching involves a feedback cycle. So we knew that. We know that. I'm really going to have to call it a day, I think. Otherwise, some of us won't get home. So a very quick question. Are there video resources of master teachers? I can't name any. It's difficult to capture actually the kind of magic that happens in classrooms when it's really communicative on video. You have to see it, you have to be there. There's probably attempts at least. But be wary of anything that, if it just includes pair work, it's not communicative. If there's students interacting, it's not communicative, not in any major sense. If there's group work, it's not communicative. If students are speaking, it's not communicative. If they're doing a describe and draw activity, it's not really communicative, not in the sense that it was originally proposed. Those are little activities, small c communicative. Just because there's interaction, just because there's speaking, it's not communicative. Communicative is where the whole experience is invested in the learners engaging with the material and running with the ball, taking the initiative, and the teachers there scaffolding what's going on. It's very difficult to capture. The very fact that there's a camera in the room is inhibiting. So, be wary of anything that calls itself communicative. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the technological problems, but anyway, we made it.